My presentation will be on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its impact mainly on the pharmaceutical industry in India, both within the Indian market and the export market. As most of you are aware, that this Trans-Pacific Partnership was concluded on the 5th of October 2015 after 7 long years of negotiation, and it is among 12 Pacific Rim countries. And of course, for the first time in a regional trade agreement, you have issues relating to the intellectual property. So before I go ahead with the presentation, which is a very short presentation, I thought it would be important to put the context of this agreement. And by context, I mean how the whole thing has moved between 1947 and 2015. Why 1947? Is it because India got independence? That's the reason, but that is not the reason for my 1947. I look at from the GATT 1947, what started off only as a reduction or a negotiation of a tariff measure to promote international trade, and over various rounds of negotiations was still keeping that as the major objective. But in the Uruguay round between 86 and 94, for the first time, in addition to tariff negotiations, we also had a few other new subjects being introduced. One of them, of course, is the TRIPS agreement. We also had trade-related investment measures. TRIPS also was there. We also had brought in agriculture and textiles and clothing, which was generally kept out of the tariff negotiations. Even that was brought in. So it became something like a very holistic trade-related measure, not only restricted to tariff measures. That's how it developed during the Uruguay round. And despite what we have, which is a multilateral trade agreement of the WTO, which means it is binding on all the countries which are members of the WTO, we also started getting plurilateral agreements within the system. Of course, plurilateral agreements bind only those countries which want to bind themselves. For example, government procurement is an example of a plurilateral agreement within the WTO system. And very interestingly, even though the most favored nation treatment was a very, very center stone or a cornerstone of this entire GATT and WTO, which is whatever is extended to one member country will be extended to all other member countries, a departure was made. Then we started into the regional free trade negotiation agreements. And each of those free trade negotiations sought to reduce the tariff further than the most favored nation treatment, which is extended to all other countries, but that was also not considered to be a departure. And all regional free trade agreements have so far remained as only issues relating to negotiating the tariff. And for the first time in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in addition to 18,000 lines of tariff items being negotiated amongst the 12 countries, we have a situation where a lot of issues relating to intellectual property have also been brought in. And that is the reason why suddenly the interest in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the measures which are included within that particular agreement, how they are likely to affect the other countries who are not a party to that, how is it likely to affect, assumes significance. So today, we are slowly moved from the multilateral to the regional trade agreements, and within regional trade agreements, we have an all-encompassing trade measures, including the intellectual property. Now, with this, I'll very quickly go into my presentation. Yeah, next slide, please. Now, of course, the TPP increases the presence of the United Nations in the region. Plus, of course, it is the U.S. National Export Initiative. It's really based on that. A very comprehensive agreement covering several different topics and issues. And as I said, for the first time in a free trade agreement, you have a comprehensive IP chapter. And IP is deemed to be investment, and therefore potential patent issues can now be subject of international arbitration. So that's how the whole thing is being brought in. And the IP chapter has been used as an attempt to clarify and develop certain minimum standards, of course, all TRIPS plus conditions. the definition of invention and non-patentable subject matter in Article 27.1 of the TRIPS, and data exclusivity provisions which are in relation to Article 39.3 of the TRIPS agreement. A number of TRIPS plus provisions are also available. Generally, if you see all articles which are appearing about the TPP, the general impression is that it will have a significant effect on access to medicines. Therefore, I was just looking at it, how does it affect the Indian pharmaceutical industry? Quickly, on the left-hand side, you see in 2005, it started off as the Trans-Pacific Economic or Strategic Economic Agreement between Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore in 2005. Slowly entered into the 12 people, and we have still Philippines and Thailand also showing interest in entering into the TPP as members. Of course, it reiterates that it will be compliant with the TRIPS. It reiterates TRIPS as well as the Doha Declaration about access to medicine and public health. So, Article 31 on compulsory license is still applicable even within the TPP. And Doha Declaration on enabling export to other developing countries in need of the drugs or medicines is still applicable. That provision has also been retained. The real crux is on this particular slide. When you look at the patentable subject matter, the agreement says the countries which are members to the PPP will be required to grant patents for new use of a known product, or for new methods of using a known product, or new processes of using a known product. I've just added, of course, nothing on derivatives or efficacy, because whenever you look at these provisions, you immediately reminded of Section 3D, where we talk about efficacy and we talk about therapeutic efficacy, etc. But here it is simple. All member countries will have a patenting systems which allows for patenting of claims for new uses of known substances. So that is a very marked advantage. Therefore, obviously, if India is to become a part of the TPP, it has to agree to that, which at least at the present stage is impossible because of Section 3D being on the statute. So that marks a very major departure. And of course, Mr. Anand pointed out that whether Section 3D is a violation of Article 27.1 under the WTO is an issue, but at least as of now, non-violation complaints on the TRIPS agreement cannot be made before the WTO dispute settlement system. It appears it is likely to change in 2017. If that changes, then whether any country would bring a dispute against, for example, India, and say whether Section 3D is a violation of that particular agreement, I think that remains to be seen. But I would probably say there is enough scope within Section 3D for India to say that it is still complying with the Article 27. But I think if it comes to a dispute, I think we'll have to look into those areas. Similarly, on the patent linkage, then they talk about the regulatory authorities to notify the patentee, and the patentee have adequate time to resolve the infringement and validity. And Mr. Anand correctly pointed out that while the courts in India have held that the patent linkage is not there, they have tried to resolve it through their acquirement actions. But not necessarily in all cases you may be able to get an infringement in acquirement action. Whereas if it is before a regulatory authority and a patent linkage is there is a clear indication to the patentee to go for an infringement trial and get the matter sorted out before the whole thing can proceed. So to that extent, there is still an issue there. And the data exclusivity on a minimum of 10 years for the agrochemicals and 5 years on pharmaceutical product, and further complicated for biologics by saying it will be 8 years or 5 years plus other measures. Of course, there is no clarity on what those other measures are. Therefore, there is definitely an issue with reference to data exclusivity. And patent term extensions, one with reference to marketing and regulatory approval, that of course is one. But even unreasonable delays by the patent office in granting a patent, if it is more than 5 years from the date of filing or more than 3 years after the date of requisition for examination, if a patent is not granted, there should be suitable measures to extend the patent term. And these are the 4 major IP provisions which all these 12 countries have agreed to implement in the system, which it's not sure as to how the whole thing would be looked at in future if other regional trade agreements also get into this, how the whole thing would develop would require to be seen. Now, what is the impact as far as India is concerned? Now, you generally find India, of course, is not a party and therefore not bound to apply TPP. But what we are really saying is we are now in that ASEAN agreement. There are some countries which are common to ASEAN and TPP. And, of course, there are also ongoing rounds of negotiations between India and US on free trade agreement. Whether TPP will influence this, it has to be seen. Similarly, there are also transatlantic negotiations with Europe, and also India-EU free trade agreements are also being negotiated. Whether in any of these, any such clauses on relating to IP would come in, whether it will be agreed to by the government, if so, what are the impact, we require to be seen. That's the reason why most of these negotiations, it's not only the WTO which takes a long time, even these agreements with 10 or 12 countries take 7 to 10 years because there are issues which could not be resolved amicably amongst the countries. Last two slides. Therefore, within the Indian market, because this is not binding, okay, the market will remain more or less the same as it is at this point of time. But what about Indian exports to those markets which will now have a different type of a patenting standard? A quick analysis, what I found was that about 11.6 billion is the market, Indian exports of pharmaceuticals to the world. Out of that, 40% is presently going to those 12 countries which are members of the TPP. And of course, out of that 40% also, you would find very significantly is the United States, which is almost like more than 32% of it comes from the United States. Therefore, these exports, whether they will be in any way impacted by the TPP, if you look at it, probably you find it may not. Because when you see the United States, while the TPP might have brought in these measures, it already has the patent linkage, it already has the data exclusivity, it has also got patent term extension. So, despite the presence of all these provisions, Indian exports to the United States have been steadily increasing and the share is around 33-35%. But critical thing is, suppose these standards of patenting were not there, there could be much more exports from India and those are affected. Yes, that could certainly be an issue. The same thing if you see is US, Australia and Canada are generally not making any difference because they already have these provisions. Some impact probably in Vietnam and potentially Thailand and Philippines, but then that accounts for less than 5% of the exports. So as the TPP stands at present, it doesn't look that will affect the market for pharmaceuticals in India and the Indian exports to these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. ParthaSarathi. I think the